What if I told you that the Truman Show became so psychologically powerful that some people genuinely believed they were living inside of it? There's a documented psychiatric phenomenon known as the Truman Show Delusion. It's rare, but it's real. In clinical literature, some individuals have reported the belief that their lives were being filmed for a hidden audience, like they were the main character in their own reality TV show. Not metaphorically, but literally. Researchers who studied these cases found a common pattern: intense feelings of surveillance, loss of privacy, and the sense that ordinary events carried hidden meaning. A strange thing happens when people think they're being watched. They stand a little straighter, they smile a little differently, they choose their words a little more carefully. Psychologists have known this for decades. It's called the Hawthorne effect. When people know that they're being observed, they change their behavior. Now here's the unsettling part. For most of human history, being watched was rare. Today, it might be one of the most common experiences on Earth. Think about it. How many photos have you taken of yourself this month? How many stories, videos, posts? How many times have you opened an app and imagined what other people might think of something you said, wore, or did? Because for the first time in human history, millions of people spend part of every day performing for an invisible audience. And that raises a question that sounds ridiculous until you really think about it. What if the Truman Show wasn't fiction? What if it was a warning? At first, that sounds absurd. Nobody built a giant television set around your life, nobody installed hidden cameras in your house, and nobody's broadcasting your every move to millions of viewers. But that was never the most frightening part about the Truman Show. The frightening part wasn't the cameras, it was what the cameras did to Truman. Without realizing it, he spent his entire life adapting himself to an audience. And when psychologists look at modern life, they're discovering something uncomfortable. Many of us are doing the same thing, not because someone forced us to, but because we learned to do it. Let's see how a movie released in 1998 accidentally predicted one of the strangest psychological shifts in human history. And by the end, you might see your phone a little differently. When The Truman Show was released, most people thought it was about surveillance. A man trapped inside a giant reality show, everyone watching, one person being watched. Simple. But looking back, that's not what the movie predicted at all. Because surveillance isn't the defining feature of modern life. Participation is. That's the twist. In Truman's world, he didn't know he was part of the show. In our world, we willingly join. Every day, we upload, share, document, broadcast. The average person now spends hours per day interacting with digital media. Entire industries exist around visibility, followers, views, likes, subscribers, reach, engagement. Words that barely existed a few decades ago now shape careers, relationships, and self-worth. And something strange happens when visibility becomes valuable. People begin optimizing it. But wait, does that actually change who we are? Or does it simply reveal who we already were? That question becomes extremely important because psychologists discovered something fascinating long before Instagram existed. Simply believing that you're being watched can alter your behavior. Imagine you're alone in a room, no cameras, no audience, no social pressure. Now imagine someone suddenly tells you that every decision you're about to make will be observed. Would you behave differently? Most people would say no. But researchers suggest otherwise. Again and again, studies have shown that observations can change behavior. This phenomenon became known as the Hawthorne effect. People work differently when watched, act differently when watched, sometimes even think differently when watched, and suddenly something about modern life becomes difficult to ignore. Because unlike previous generations, many of us carry the possibility of observation everywhere that we go. A camera is never far away, an audience is never that far, a potential judgment is never that far. And here's where things become unsettling. The problem isn't necessarily that other people are watching. The problem is that eventually you start watching yourself through their eyes. And that's where The Truman Show becomes much more than just a movie. Because psychologists discovered another phenomenon that sounds almost identical to Truman's experience. Imagine looking at yourself the way a stranger would, not occasionally, but constantly. Researchers call this self-objectification. Instead of experiencing life from the inside, you begin evaluating your life from the outside. How do I look? How do I sound? How did that come across? What will people think? And at first that might not sound dangerous, but think about what it means. A part of your attention leaves the present moment and begins observing you like an audience member, watching, judging, evaluating. Suddenly, you're not just living life, you're managing your image of your life. And social media may have accelerated this process dramatically. Because for the first time in history, ordinary people gained access to something previously reserved for celebrities, a permanent audience. But here's the contradiction. Social media promised connection, so why do many people report feeling anxious, lonely, and self-conscious? Something doesn't add up. And the answer might be hidden in one of the most famous scenes from The Truman Show, the moment Truman begins noticing cracks in his reality. Because once he sees them, he can't unsee them. And we're about to encounter a crack in ours. Now pause for a second. Think back to The Truman Show Delusion. Because this isn't about whether those beliefs are true or false. It's about why that specific idea appears in human psychology at all. Why that narrative? Why a show? Why an audience? Because it reveals something deeper about how the brain interprets modern social pressure. We are wired to detect observation, to adjust behavior, to anticipate judgment. And in a world where cameras are everywhere, where posting is constant, where visibility is currency, that system doesn't shut off anymore. It amplifies. And this is where The Truman Show stops being fiction entirely. Not because we are being filmed like Truman, but because we behave like we are. And once psychologists began studying this, they found something even more surprising. We don't just act differently when we think we're being watched. We begin building identities around being watched. Social media didn't invent attention-seeking behavior, it scaled it, permanently. Studies in psychology have repeatedly found links between social media use and increased self-focused attention, appearance monitoring, and social comparison. One major review published in clinical psychology research found consistent associations between frequent social media engagement and heightened anxiety and depressive symptoms in certain populations, especially in adolescents and young adults. But the mechanism here is what matters. Because the brain doesn't fully distinguish between being observed in real life and being perceived online. To your nervous system, attention is attention, and attention changes behavior. So what happens when everyday life becomes something that might be seen, recorded, or shared? You start curating it. You start filtering it. You start editing yourself in real time. Not just what you post, but how you live. And slowly something subtle happens. You stop asking, what do I feel, and start asking, how will this look? That shift is important because it's the exact psychological movement from lived experience to performed experience, which is the foundation of The Truman Show. But there's another layer most people don't talk about, because we're not only performing for others, we're performing for people we've never met. Psychologists call them parasocial relationships, one-sided emotional bonds with people you don't know personally. Celebrities, influencers, creators, even strangers on short-form video platforms. Research shows that these relationships can feel emotionally real to the brain, real enough to influence mood, self-image, and behavior. Now, think about what The Truman Show experienced. He had an audience he never saw, but that audience influenced his world. And now flip that. We see creators, we follow lives, we compare and internalize. We build expectations from curated realities. And again, a contradiction appears. We feel more connected than ever, but report increasing loneliness. So what's happening? Is it connection or is it comparison? Because comparison is what drives most of the emotional weight in modern social life. Not direct interaction, but perceived distance between your life and someone else's highlight reel. And the gap changes how people see themselves. But there's an even deeper shift happening beneath all of this. Something that feels almost invisible until you notice it. We are beginning to treat life itself like content. Think about a simple moment. Eating at a restaurant, going for a walk, or meeting friends. None of them used to require thought about an audience. Now many of them do. Not always consciously, but implicitly. Is this worth posting? Does this look good? Would people even care? And once that question enters the mind, something changes. The moment becomes slightly less lived, and slightly more recorded. This is where The Truman Show becomes psychologically precise. Because Truman's world wasn't fake because it was staged. It was fake because it was curated around perception. and modern life increasingly follows that same structure, not by force, but by habit. But there's still a bigger question underneath all of this. If we are becoming more self-aware, more observed, and more curated, what is it doing to the human mind long term? Research in psychology suggests that chronic self-monitoring is associated with increased anxiety and reduced emotional spontaneity. When attention is constantly split between experience and observation of experience, the present moment becomes harder to fully inhabit. You are there, but you're also watching yourself be there. And over time, that creates a subtle fragmentation. Not dramatic, not obvious, but persistent. A life that's slightly less lived and slightly more managed. Which brings us back to Truman. Because the most powerful moment in the film isn't when he discovers the truth. It's when he chooses to leave anyway. Even with uncertainty, even without guarantees. He stops performing, and he starts living. So what does this mean for us? It doesn't mean your life is a TV show, it doesn't mean you're being watched in the way Truman was, but it might mean something more uncomfortable. That modern life is constantly inviting you to observe yourself from the outside, to optimize yourself, perform yourself, curate yourself. And the danger isn't visibility itself, it's forgetting what it feels like to exist without it. Because Truman's escape wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He stopped living for an audience and started living for experience. So here's the question this movie leaves behind. If you remove the idea of an audience, even for a moment, what would you change about the way you live? Not what you post, not what you show, but what you actually experience when nobody's watching. Because maybe the real Truman Show isn't about being controlled by others. Maybe it's about slowly learning to control yourself through imagined eyes. And the most important escape isn't leaving a set. It's leaving the performance. And returning to a life that doesn't need to be watched to be real.